What you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version found in history textbooks or official victory reports. According to declassified operational records and post-war sniper testimonies, the nights fought in the jungles of Southeast Asia were not designed merely to kill American soldiers, they were engineered to dismantle the human mind. Military archives describe the jungle at night as an environment where modern warfare collapsed into something primitive. Vision failed first. Then sound. Then certainty. Dense vegetation blocked moonlight entirely. Humidity pressed down like a physical weight, soaking uniforms, weapons, and skin. Radios crackled unpredictably. Maps lost meaning when every direction looked identical. For American snipers trained in marksmanship, patience, and distance, the night erased every advantage they believed they had. Pay close attention to this point. The enemy understood the jungle better than any foreign army ever could. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They waited. And waiting was the weapon. Veteran snipers later described the night as alive. Not metaphorically, literally. Leaves shifted without wind. Branches snapped softly, deliberately. Insects stopped chirping all at once, a silence so sudden it triggered instinctive panic. Training manuals warned soldiers not to fire at sound alone. But fear doesn't read manuals. This is the side of war few are willing to discuss, the psychological battlefield that begins long before the first shot is fired. Operational reports from reconnaissance units show a recurring pattern. Enemy forces rarely attacked immediately after nightfall. They allowed hours to pass. American snipers, already exhausted from daytime movement and heat, were forced into static positions, sometimes lying motionless in mud or shallow depressions for 6, 8, even 10 hours. Movement risked detection. Stillness invited imagination. And imagination became the enemy. Men trained to calculate wind speed and bullet drop found themselves counting heartbeats instead. Every breath felt too loud. Every muscle twitch felt fatal. Sweat pooled under their bodies, mixing with soil and insects. Leeches attached unnoticed. No one dared react. Then came the sounds. Soft footfalls. A whisper, possibly language, possibly jungle noise. Metal brushing metal equipment, maybe a rifle sling. Records show that these sounds were often intentional. Recon teams would circle positions without attacking, testing reactions, mapping fear. The objective wasn't engagement. It was erosion. Snipers reported the same sequence over and over. First, confusion, the inability to identify direction or distance. Second, the sensation of being surrounded, even when alone. Third, the crushing realization that if an attack came, it would be at arm's length, not from afar. Silent. Sudden. Fatal. One after-action report recounts a sniper pair remaining frozen for nearly 9 hours while enemy movement passed within meters of their position. No shots were fired. No contact officially recorded. Yet both men were later evacuated for psychological collapse. No physical wounds. No visible injuries. Just minds pushed past endurance. This was not accidental. This was doctrine. As the war progressed, night operations increasingly focused on psychological destabilization. Fatigue was cultivated deliberately. Sleep deprivation became routine. Snipers began to doubt their own perceptions. Some fired prematurely. Others hesitated too long. Both outcomes were deadly. By the end of these nights, decisions were no longer tactical. They were instinctual. And instinct, under that kind of pressure, often betrayed them. These were not just ambushes. They were lessons in helplessness. And as we move forward, you'll see how these nocturnal encounters followed a chilling psychological pattern, one that repeated itself night after night, slowly reshaping how these men fought, reacted, and survived. What made these night encounters truly devastating wasn't the violence. It was the waiting. Declassified field manuals and sniper debriefings reveal a brutal paradox: the more skilled a sniper became, the more vulnerable he was at night. Training emphasized patience, immobility, and restraint, exactly the traits the enemy learned to exploit. By midnight, physical discomfort had already turned into psychological strain. Muscles cramped. Circulation slowed. Nerves burned under constant tension. Snipers were trained to ignore pain, but the jungle introduced a different enemy, sensory overload combined with deprivation. You could hear everything. You could see nothing. Military psychologists later described this as forced hypervigilance. The mind remains fully alert while the body is prohibited from action. Over time, this imbalance produces distortions. Sounds feel closer than they are. Time stretches unnaturally. Fear becomes analytical, then emotional, then uncontrollable. Operational logs show that enemy units often approached in staggered phases. One element would probe first, barely making contact with the environment. The goal was to trigger alertness without confirmation. Then silence. Long enough for doubt to grow. Then movement again, closer. Snipers began questioning their own senses. Was that real? Did I imagine it? If I move, will I die? Veteran testimony frequently mentions the same moment, the realization that staying still was no longer protection, it was imprisonment. Some snipers described feeling their heartbeat echo through their entire body. Others recalled pressing their face into the mud to muffle breathing. Several admitted to shallow, almost involuntary breathing patterns, fearing the sound of oxygen itself. This wasn't accidental chaos. It was psychological architecture. Enemy tactics deliberately avoided immediate engagement. Killing one sniper was less valuable than forcing many into exhaustion and error. Reports indicate that after repeated nights of this exposure, snipers became slower to react during daytime operations. Hands shook. Decision-making hesitated. Confidence eroded. In one documented case, a sniper team broke protocol after hours of perceived encirclement. One soldier shifted position slightly. The movement was minimal, barely a ripple in foliage. But it was enough. A single suppressed shot followed seconds later. Clean. Precise. The shooter was never seen. The surviving sniper later stated he never heard the shot, only felt his partner collapse beside him. Fatal mistakes weren't always loud. Sometimes they arrived quietly, like relief. Psychological evaluations conducted months later revealed recurring symptoms: auditory hallucinations, chronic insomnia, and hyperreactivity to environmental noise. Leaves rustling. Distant footsteps. Even air conditioning units triggered panic responses. The jungle followed them home. And yet, perhaps the most disturbing pattern was moral erosion. After nights spent believing death was imminent, some snipers admitted they began hoping for contact, not to win, but to end the waiting. That desire alone terrified them more than the enemy ever could. Because once a soldier hopes for violence, something essential has already broken. As the war intensified, these nights multiplied. Each one chipped away at restraint, judgment, and identity. The jungle didn't need to fire every time. It only needed to be present. And in the next part, we'll examine how these nocturnal tactics escalated, shifting from passive psychological pressure to carefully timed, devastating ambushes that forced irreversible decisions in seconds. By the time these night operations reached their peak, the jungle was no longer just terrain. It had become a weapon. After months of conditioning through fear and exhaustion, enemy forces began transitioning from psychological pressure to precision violence. The shift was subtle, deadly, and devastatingly effective. Field reports indicate that ambushes were rarely chaotic. They were timed to moments of maximum vulnerability, just before dawn, when fatigue peaked and concentration collapsed. Snipers who had survived hours of mental siege now faced seconds to decide. This is where mistakes became irreversible. According to after-action documents, ambushes often began with a single disorienting event. A flare detonated behind the position. A sudden burst of fire from an unexpected angle. Or, more chillingly, complete silence followed by a close-range shot. The objective was not suppression, it was paralysis. Veterans described the sensation as the jungle folding inward. Visibility shrank to arm's length. Familiar reference points vanished. Commands were swallowed by foliage. Radios failed or gave away positions. Every trained response suddenly felt wrong. In one recorded encounter, a sniper team detected movement but delayed engagement, haunted by previous false alarms. That hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds. An enemy fighter emerged from a concealed trench system no more than 10 meters away. 2 shots. 2 casualties. The ambush ended before reinforcements even understood it had begun. Silent. Sudden. Final. The psychological damage was cumulative. Survivors began second-guessing every instinct. Fire too early, risk exposure. Wait too long, die unseen. There was no correct answer. Only consequences. Documents reveal that enemy units studied American reactions carefully. If snipers fired at sound, decoys were used. If they waited, close assaults followed. Adaptation was constant. Predictability was punished. One sniper later testified that the worst moment wasn't the firefight, it was the second after silence returned. That pause, when the mind replayed every decision, every delay, every breath. Survival didn't feel like victory. It felt like borrowed time. Psychologists noted that repeated exposure to these encounters altered perception permanently. Time compression. Tunnel hearing. Emotional detachment. Men spoke of watching themselves act, as if separated from their own bodies. A defense mechanism and a warning sign. Moral dilemmas emerged in these moments. Fire into darkness without confirmation? Risk civilian presence? Hold fire and protect conscience, or engage and live with doubt forever? These weren't theoretical questions. They were forced, instantly, under threat of death. Records show that some snipers carried these decisions far longer than any physical injury. Guilt became as persistent as fear. The jungle didn't just threaten life, it demanded choices that followed men home. As ambushes grew more efficient, American forces adjusted tactics. But adaptation came at a cost. Aggression replaced caution. Sleep was sacrificed for alertness. Humanity narrowed to survival. And in the final phase of these nights, something irreversible happened, the line between resilience and damage blurred completely. In the next part, we'll explore how repeated survival reshaped identity itself and why some veterans said the war never truly ended when they left the jungle. By this stage of the war, survival itself had become a burden. Operational summaries and long-term veteran interviews reveal a disturbing truth: the men who endured the most night ambushes were often the ones most profoundly altered by them. Not because they were weak, but because they adapted too well. Adaptation, in this environment, meant emotional narrowing. Snipers learned to suppress empathy, to silence hesitation, to treat every sound as hostile. This mindset kept them alive. It also isolated them from everything else. Military psychiatrists later described this condition as combat survival distortion. The mind recalibrates so completely to threat that peace becomes foreign. In the jungle, this recalibration happened nightly. Veterans recalled reaching a point where fear no longer spiked, it flattened. Not calm. Not confidence. Just emptiness. The waiting no longer hurt. The silence no longer screamed. That numbness was dangerous. It made lethal decisions easier and remorse delayed. One declassified case study details a sniper who fired on a suspected movement during a night watch, later discovering no weapon, no confirmed enemy. No reprimand followed. No investigation. The war moved on. He did not. Years later, he described that moment as heavier than any confirmed kill. Because in the dark, certainty never came, only consequences. The jungle exploited this erosion mercilessly. Enemy forces understood that exhausted minds commit errors faster than frightened ones. Prolonged exposure to night stress created aggression, impatience, and fatal overconfidence. Some snipers began breaking discipline, shortening watch cycles, moving more frequently, taking risks they once avoided. Every adjustment was an attempt to reclaim control. Every adjustment also increased vulnerability. Reports from late war operations show a rise in close contact encounters, not because tactics improved, but because restraint collapsed. Men wanted the night to end. They wanted confrontation over uncertainty. This is where identity fractured. Veterans spoke of losing track of who they were before the jungle. Days blurred. Faces faded. Only routines remained. Check equipment. Find position. Wait. Survive. Repeat. When these men eventually rotated out, the contrast was jarring. Civilization felt artificial. Noise felt aggressive. Darkness triggered immediate alertness. Sleep became impossible without light or sound. Psychological evaluations decades later show consistent patterns: hypervigilance, emotional detachment, and persistent intrusive memories, not of battles, but of waiting. Of listening. Of imagining footsteps that may or may not have existed. The jungle never announced its attacks. It conditioned minds until damage became invisible. And yet, despite this, many veterans refused to frame themselves as victims. They spoke instead of responsibility to their partners, their mission, and the men who didn't come back. Which leads us to the final reflection. Because the true legacy of these nights isn't measured in enemy casualties or tactical success. It's measured in what remained afterward. In the final part, we'll examine why these experiences continue to haunt memory and what they reveal about the limits of human endurance in war. What ultimately survived these nights was not victory, but memory. Decades after the last shots were fired in the jungles of Southeast Asia, veterans still describe the night as the most enduring battlefield. Not the firefights. Not the casualties. The waiting. The listening. The certainty that something unseen was always closer than it should be. Military historians often measure wars in territory gained or lost. But psychological records tell a different story. These nocturnal ambushes redefined the limits of mental resistance. They proved that a soldier could remain physically intact while being quietly dismantled from within. Former snipers explained it with unsettling clarity: the jungle taught them that survival was not the same as escape. You could leave the war, but the night stayed. Clinical studies conducted years later revealed that many veterans struggled to articulate what haunted them most. There were no clear images. No single moment of terror. Instead, there was atmosphere. Pressure. Anticipation without release. The mind learned to live in permanent expectation of threat. That expectation reshaped identity. Some veterans avoided forests entirely. Others couldn't sleep in silence. Many reported an irrational dread of darkness paired with an inability to relax in daylight. The body learned lessons the conscious mind could not unlearn. Yet within these accounts, there is no self-pity. Only reflection. They speak of responsibility to those who froze beside them in the mud, to those who made the wrong decision once, and to those who never had the chance to decide at all. The moral weight of those nights did not fade with time. If anything, it sharpened. According to declassified assessments, these ambushes succeeded precisely because they blurred the line between external threat and internal collapse. The enemy didn't need overwhelming force. They needed patience, silence, understanding of human limits. And those limits were reached repeatedly. What these nights revealed is something uncomfortable: resilience has a cost. The mind can endure extraordinary pressure, but it does not do so without consequence. Strength, pushed too far, becomes fracture. The jungle did not roar. It whispered. And men listened until listening changed them. This is why these experiences remain among the most psychologically crushing episodes of the war. Not because they were loud or cinematic, but because they were intimate. Personal. Inescapable. To remember them now is not to glorify suffering, but to acknowledge it. To recognize that behind every operational success were individuals who carried the unseen aftermath. They survived the night. But the night never fully released them.